Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's about 1:15 on a Friday afternoon, August 16th. The weather is warm. I will be sweaty by the time I get home, but I am actually walking home from work, back to the original purpose of the podcast. So happy to chat with you about games today. In starting to think about this episode, I had an idea, and then I looked at the archives of the podcast and I realized I'd already done some of it. So I'm starting with a question, which you can go into the Boardgame Geek Guild 3269 to answer, or send me an email, brendan@rattleboxgames.com, if you don't want to make your public statement. Or you could go to the Rattlebox Games Facebook page, I guess, would be another place. But what I want to know is, have you heard enough about London? So last night, my wife and I played our 10th game of London this year, or I played my 10th game of London this year. It was probably the 6th game I've played with my wife. And so I have finished the London part of my 10 for 10. And so I'm curious if you are interested in hearing more about London now that I've played it 10 times this year. I'm interested. I certainly have things I could say about the strategic aspects of it that are opening up to me in this many plays. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I don't win every game, but I do win a fair amount of the time, or I do well enough that I don't lose disastrously. That said, when I looked up London on the Rattlebox Games website to see what I'd said about it already, I found that back in episode 121, I did an episode called DUEL, London versus Wingspan, because both are card-based engine building games, and so I thought there was an interesting similarity of idea and effort and goal there that made it worth talking about the two games in concert with one another. But it also made me think, oh man, I've already talked about London quite a bit, and I know I mention it often. So I guess that's the leading question. For those of you who listen and are interested, are you interested to have me talk for a significant amount of time, a whole episode about London, to do a Message from the Deep episode? If so, post in the forums. If not, post in the forums. I will go with the consensus in the forums. We'll say the official place to respond to this is Boardgame Geek Guild 3269 in the post about this episode. If you're indifferent, don't answer and let other people decide. So that left me with a question, though. If I was going to leave it up to you whether I was going to say more about London, then I needed something else to talk about. And having seen the DUEL episode, I decided I would do another one of these. Walking under some cicadas here. So, if you don't recall the DUEL episode, I picked two games that I feel like, even if they aren't thematically connected, have a kind of similarity in experience that makes it worth talking about them together. And so I looked at my 10 for 10 list and I thought a little bit about the games I've played, and I decided to do a DUEL, one of the games from this year's 10 for 10 versus one of the games from last year's 10 for 10. And this would be Gizmos versus Century. Dun dun dun, DUEL. Okay. In one corner we have Century. Century is a game from Plan B Games, made by Emerson Matsuuchi, and it is a cube-pushing economic game. In Century, you play, well, I have the Golem Edition, but the Spice Trading Edition is functionally the same. They just have a different theme. So in Century, you play a merchant trying to make money and achieve goals by exchanging one set of colored cubes for another set of colored cubes, and building an engine in which you can exchange cubes for other cubes and use those cubes to buy awards, basically. The way the game plays is that you have four things you can do on your turn. You can either take a card from the card market, you can buy an award from the award market, and you have to have the right combination of cubes to buy that award, which will give you points. You can play a card and do the thing that the card does for you, or you can pick up all your cards. So a big part of the game is buying cards from the market with a strategy toward building up an engine that allows you to exchange cubes for other cubes. Now, I wouldn't say I'm amazing at this game, but I'm pretty good at it. And for me, the key element to making the game work well is to build an engine that allows you to exchange some cubes for other cubes multiple times. One of the most important rules of the game is that when you play an exchange card, let's say it lets you exchange, well, I'm going to use Golem terms because that's the game I have, 2 green crystals for a blue and 3 yellows. You are allowed to do that more than once. So if you have 4 green crystals, you could do that exchange twice. That's the only kind of card that lets you trigger more than once. If you have one of the upgrade cards or one of the cube generation cards, those only trigger one time when you play them. But the exchange cards, you can trigger more than once. So in games where I win, usually it's where I've managed to build an engine in which I'm exchanging multiple sets of crystals at the same time. And that gets me an engine. I would say my other basic bit of advice there is you don't want to run yourself down to nothing. So unless it's a real race to get a very valuable card, I generally try to keep a few crystals back when I'm buying a card so that my engine doesn't grind to a halt and I have to start over from the beginning, as opposed to having the engine kind of keep running by leaving some crystals in my possession to fuel it. Century is a really good game because the complexity all comes from the interchange of cards. It's pretty open in terms of learning to play. You get to do a thing for yourself, which feels really good, even if you're getting clobbered by your opponents. One of the things I don't like about it is it ends awfully fast. As soon as someone takes their 5th card or 6th card in a 2-player game, 2 or 3-player game, I think, then the game ends. Which means that if people aren't being careful, it's really easy to suddenly find that you have 1 turn left to do something and then you can't do anything, or you get stuck in between cycles. So especially for less experienced players, it can be a real kick in the face when the game ends quickly. That said, I find Century really satisfying because building that engine is immediate. You can kind of see it coming. The turns are very fast, so you can plan 3 or 4 turns out ahead, and it doesn't take 20 minutes to do those turns. It takes 2 minutes, as everybody's taking their turns fairly quickly. So that's Century. I also have Century on the brain because any day now I have Century Eastern Mountains, the next game in the series, which they finally released in the Golem form, coming in the mail. So I'm very excited about that. Okay, so that's Century. Then the game that I have up against it is one of the games for my 10 for 10 this year, and that is Gizmos. Gizmos is an engine building game from Phil Walker Harding, the guy who designed Baron Park and Imhotep and Sushi Go. Imhotep I did not enjoy very much. Sushi Go and Baron Park are games I really, really enjoy. Very excited for the Baron Park expansion, the Grizzlies, which should be coming out very soon. They had some copies at Gen Con, but I did not realize that, nor did I have time to get it anyway. So, Sushi Go is another engine building game. If you haven't played it, Gizmos is another engine building game. In this one, you're building a variety of machines, and each of these machines is represented by a card in a tableau, and they trigger when you do something else. So you might have a card that triggers when you build a red gizmo. So if you take a card with the red border, then your card that triggers when you build a red gizmo triggers, and you get to do whatever it says there. So what happens is, as the game goes along, you start buying more and more cards and putting them in your tableau, and you have more and more things that trigger when you do something. So you might have a card that triggers when you pick a red marble, and you might have another card that triggers whenever you pick any marble. And both of those might be triggered might then be triggered by something else. And so you get these kind of chain reactions that allow you to do a variety of things. There's also upgrade cards that allow you to pretend that one marble is a different color, and you take the marbles are the currency you use to buy the cards. And ultimately your goal is to get points. Every gizmo you build is also worth points. There are some higher value gizmos that take more marbles to build, and those ones are worth a lot of points and or accelerate the game. The game ends when someone has 16 gizmos built, or when they have built their fourth level 3 gizmo. Like Century, the game has a very quick end timer. When someone has their 16th gizmo built, or their fourth level 3 gizmo, you finish the round and the game's over. Just like with Century, you finish the round once someone buys their last card. Also, like Century, it's a game of fairly short turns early on. The turns get a little more complex as the game goes along, but by the time that's happening, it's almost over. Like Century, you get to build a kind of a really interesting machine, and if you're careful and you really focus on making that machine play off of itself, you can get a really robust result, which makes for really entertaining play. So those are the ways that Gizmos and Century are the same. Century is far more deterministic than Gizmos. Gizmos has an element of luck because when you're getting marbles, you're drawing them often you're either picking them out of this row, and so you don't always have control about what marbles are available, or you're drawing them blindly out of this bin, and when you draw them out of the bin, you don't know what color you're going to get. That said, there's only 4 colors of marble, and it's pretty easy to get elements of your gizmos that allow you to manipulate the marbles into different colors. So I've never found the limitations of color too significant in playing a game of gizmos. Both Gizmos and Century take about 20 minutes to play. Gizmos has a bit more fiddliness in terms of getting your table set up. You have to lay your cards out in a tableau and keep track of which ones you've used. I've actually added cubes to my set of gizmos so that in later turns when you're triggering 4 or 5 cards, you can use a cube to keep track of which ones you've activated, because you can activate each cube each card only once per turn. And the way your tableau is set up, it's not convenient to use changing the orientation of the card like you would if you were tapping a card that had been activated in the traditional way. So, thinking about these as a duel, which game is better? I find Century a more satisfying game. I think it plays a little more smoothly. It's a little easier to understand. That said, there's not quite as much going on. So the engine you're building in Century is a bit tighter. The engine you're building in Gizmos, there are a wider variety of things you can do with it. And everything you do gets you points, whereas Century, you're only getting points when you take those point cards, which means that somebody who's having trouble getting their system going is just stalled. Whereas in Gizmos, every time you're buying a card, which is almost every turn, you are gaining points. That said, in Century, it's easier to get, I've found it's more satisfying or easier to get a really interesting machine going that's really compelling, whereas in Gizmos, I often end up getting a machine that's more generalized. It reacts to several different things, but it's not a powerhouse in a specific way. That said, maybe I'm just not very good at Gizmos. It also takes a bit more effort to set up and explain. I find both really interesting and fun. Both are going to remain in my collection for the time being. Century is more attractive to my family. They like the Golem theme better than the sci-fi machine theme, although my daughter likes Gizmos just fine. So overall, both games have their strengths, and both are interesting, lightweight, engine-building games that play in 20 to 40 minutes and are easy to teach. If you get an opportunity to try either one of them, I recommend them both. Century is a bit wider coverage because it's been out longer, and frankly it's a smaller footprint and I think a cheaper game, probably by $5 or $10. So all of those things together make Century the better bet for something to try out, but either one is a fun time and I would recommend as a game you might enjoy playing. So that I'm curious if you've played either of these games, or if you have another game that you would describe as a light to middleweight engine builder that plays in under an hour, I'd be interested to hear how it compares to these two games and where you fit it. The place where you can go tell me that is Boardgame Geek, Guild 3269. That's also the place you can go to weigh in on the question of, should I do an episode in which I do a message from the deep about London, or have you heard enough about the Martin Wallace classic released as a second edition last year? Let me know over on Boardgame Geek, Guild 3269, and I'll be excited to hear your answer. In the meantime, I hope that you have had a pleasant day. Thanks for joining me on my walk, and I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.